Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Cogito Ergo Pod. I'm your host Daniel, and in this episode we will be continuing our look at one of the most important periods in Christian history, the Protestant Reformation. I've split this bad boy over a couple of episodes because I do not think that there is anyone who wants to listen to the whole history of this event in one go. Unless it is being used as some kind of cruel and unusual punishment, I suppose. As I said in the last episode, I want to focus on the historical aspect of the Reformation. This is, after all, religious history at its finest, or perhaps its worst. This episode will give a brief overview of some of the other characters in this story, men who shaped the events over the 100 plus years which made up the Reformation. I will also cover some of the more considerable historical events, and they will mostly have titles that end with the word war. I do not want to get bogged down in the theological semantics, so I will try to keep it focused mostly on the historical aspects. This will be a whistle-stop tour of centuries of personalities, wars, and warring personalities. To look properly at the theology surrounding the Reformation would require a shed load more episodes, and for me, to give up working and to research it all full time. No need to give me an excuse. So with that in mind, and with another deep breath, let us begin. As some of you know, and if you don't, well done, the last episode focused primarily on the life and times of the man held responsible by many for the events surrounding the Protestant Reformation. The one, the only, Martin Luther. However, instead of getting bogged down in long-winded profiles of the bearded multitudes, I want to start off with a brief overview by getting bogged down in the bearded multitudes, some of the key players who played a crucial part in the Reformation. First, we have Erasmus Gerason, 1469 to 1536, better known simply as Erasmus, or Erasmus Desiderius, Desiderius being Greek for Erasmus. So, Erasmus. So good he named himself twice. Didn't Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly sing a song about this? Anyway, he rose up from simple beginnings to become one of the greatest scholars of the Reformation. His writings, especially his own version of the Greek New Testament, being the first modern critical edition of the text, were inspirational for many of the reformers. He, however, did not fall in with their reforming ideals and remained a Catholic all his life. Interestingly enough, he is believed to have been in love with a fellow monk, Servetus Rogerus, to whom he wrote passionate letters. Rogerus. I think someone has been watching too much Monty Python Life of Brian. Next up is Frederick III, Duke of Saxony. We met him before, 1463 to 1525. The ruler of Electoral Saxony. He provided a safe place for Luther during those difficult times after 1517. He arranged for Luther's kidnap after the Diet of Worms. Despite supporting Luther, Frederick III remained a lifelong Catholic. The Duke was also renowned for his collection of relics, which numbered some 19,000 items. If you had venerated each piece, it was believed you would get a total of 1,900,009 days off purgatory. That would be 5,205.5 years off. Now, I think it's time to look at some of the real reformers. Philip Melanchthon, 1490 to 1525, was Luther's number 2 in Wittenberg. Melanchthon was an academic, educator and translator. He tried to systemize Luther's teachings and, in doing so, really developed Lutheranism. He dedicated himself to bringing unity between reformers and even made significant compromises with the Catholics. Melanchthon's real name was Philip Schwarzerd, Schwarzerd meaning black earth. Melanchthon means the same, but in Greek. Thomas Mutzer, 1490 to 1525, was a former priest who was inspired by Luther. He did, however, take Luther's ideas in a violent revolutionary direction. Mutzer moved to Allstadt and then Mühlhausen, where he created worship services in German, embraced Anabaptism, and demanded radical social change. He led an armed uprising during the Peasants' War and was defeated, captured, tortured and executed. So he went to Mulhausen for some shithausen. Karlstadt was one of the most radical of the reformers. While Luther was absent from Wittenberg, Karlstadt held services in the vernacular, got married, and refused to wear clerical garb. Luther forced him into exile, but his work and teachings still remained very influential. While in exile, he found work as a proofreader in Zurich, all thanks to our next personality. Huldrych Zwingli, whose name I love, 1484 to 1531, was a former mercenary chaplain and leader of the Reformation in Switzerland. In Zurich he developed a plain, austere form of the Reformation worship. He banned icons and images and argued that communion was surely symbolic. He always denied being influenced by Luther, with whom he bitterly argued. He persecuted Anabaptists and was killed in battle. However, he wasn't all doom and gloom. Zwingli could play 6 instruments, but he banned the use of music in his churches. Johannes Wecko-Lampadium, 1482 to 1531, was a preacher in Basel, Switzerland. He took up Luther's ideas for a while, then gave them up and became a monk. He then left that to become a reformer again. He led the Reformation in Basel and supported Zwingli against Luther. He was more of a leader than a theologian, and his name in fact meant house lamp. I have in fact included him here, more for his name than for anything he contributed. Jacob Arminius, 1560 to 1609, was a former Calvinist pastor turned anti-predestination campaigner. A professor of the University of Leiden, he developed a theory that came to be known as Arminianism. Although he was condemned at the time, Arminius's theories would later be taken up by John Wellesley, the founder of Methodism. John Smith, 1554 to 1612, was a Puritan preacher. He left the church to found his own separatist congregation. John and his congregation fled to Holland in 1609, where he founded the first modern Baptist church. Later, he became a Mennonite. Smith's church in Holland was known as the Brethren of the Separation of the Second English Church at Amsterdam. Quite the mouthful. Now we have one of the big boys. John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, also known as Jean Calvin and the Frenchman, is a particularly well-known name in Scottish Protestant circles. Fun-loving, wild, wacky, happy-go-lucky are all words that no one would ever associate with John Calvin. A man of iron self-discipline and deeply penetrating intellect, Calvinism became the dominant Protestant theology after his death. The theological system of Calvin and his followers is marked by strong emphasis on the sovereignty of God, the depravity of humankind, and the doctrine of predestination. Predestination is the doctrine that God, in consequence of his foreknowledge of all events, infallibly guides those who are destined for salvation. God, with all his knowledge, already knows who is destined to go to heaven and those who will not. However, despite everything already being predestined, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be going to church and following Calvinistic theology. See, that is why I didn't want to get into the theology of it all. I love it, but Reformation theology, whatever form it takes, gets everything in a bit muddled. Nevertheless, Calvin transformed Geneva into his ideal city, so not a very fun place to be. Calvin preached over 2,000 sermons, and I am sure that each one was more witty and amusing than the last. Ha! Speaking of fun-time boys, John Knox, 1513 to 1572, was a man of tremendous courage and principle. Admittedly, a lot of those principles were narrow and misogynistic, but you can't have everything. A powerful preacher, he established the Church of Scotland as a Presbyterian system based on Calvinist lines. So nothing but banter and japes for all. His views of the authority of monarchs were to influence Puritans in England. He was also known for not being the biggest fan of Mary, Queen of Scots. Perhaps he could be grateful to know that his burial place is now a parking space number 23 behind St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. Nothing too flashy, but very practical. So there you have it, the long-winded version... Wait, I promised none of the long-winded version, didn't I? Oops! These were some of the big players in Protestantism's birth and afterbirth, each and all unique in their approaches to tackling this new dawn in European religion and politics. So let's get away from predestination, communion, all things theological, and dive into why everyone is here. The fighting. The European wars of religion, starting arguably with the Hussite wars of the early 15th century and lasting until the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, were all part and parcel of the Reformation. The majority of armed conflicts between these two events in Europe has some element of Catholic versus Protestant to it, so it would only seem right and fair to have a little look at some important altercations between the two sides. For a little additional context, it is important to remember that the Holy Roman Empire was not one united entity, but rather a collection of estates and principalities loosely connected by a Holy Roman Emperor who was elected. Because it was so large, it represented a wide range of government styles, independent states, and with the Reformation, religions. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500 to 1558, was an ardent Catholic who sought to unite the empire under Catholicism, which prompted a series of religious wars, including the disastrous 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648. However, going back to 1519, King Charles of Spain was elected as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Charles V declared Martin Luther and his religion illegal, banned any practice or distribution of his Protestant ideas. It was in 1530, at the Diet of Augsburg, that nobles agreed to pledge their loyalty to Charles V if he recognised Protestantism as a valid religion in the empire. Charles refused. Empire princes formed the Schmalkaldic League in 1531 to defend themselves and their Protestant religion against Charles. Two of the most influential Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire formed the League, Philip of Hesse and John Frederick I, Elector of Saxony. Each member pledged to help defend the other should Charles V attack their lands because of their religion. In addition, they formed alliances with Denmark and France. The League's name came from the German town of Schmalkalden. Distracted by the Turkish threat on his eastern borders, Charles de facto recognised the League. After he defeated the Turks, however, Charles repressed the League, setting off the First Schmalkaldic War, 1546 to 1547. Charles crushed the League, but their Protestantism ran deep, and Charles was again denied his dream of religious unity. He instead tried to compromise with the Augsburg Interim in 1548, but it did not help. The Second Schmalkaldic War, 1552 to 1555, erupted over dissatisfaction with the Augsburg Interim. This time, the Protestants won, and Charles had to provide a better compromise to gain peace. The Augsburg religious settlement of 1555 brought peace to the empire. It declared that the official religion of a territory matched its leader's religion. The Schmalkaldic Wars were only the warm-up act when it came to the religious violence waiting to be released across continental Europe. It would be about 60 years before there was a full release of religious animosity with the 30 Years' War. The outbreak of the 30 Years' War is generally traced to 1618, when Emperor Frederick II was deposed by King of Bohemia and replaced by the Protestant Frederick V of the Palatinate. I am not going to begin trying to explain what the Palatinate was, but needless to say, it was nothing to do with Star Wars. Although imperial forces quickly suppressed the Bohemian revolt, his participation expanded the fighting into the Palatinate, whose strategic importance drew in the Dutch Republic and Spain, then engaged in the 80 Years' War. Since rulers like Charles IV of Denmark and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden also held territories within the empire, this gave them and other foreign powers an excuse to intervene, turning an internal dynastic dispute into a broader European conflict. The first phase, from 1618 to 1635, was primarily a civil war between German members of the Holy Roman Empire, with support from external powers. However, after 1635, the empire became only one theatre in a wider struggle between France, supported by Sweden, and Emperor Frederick III, allied with Spain. An extraordinary feature of this conflict is that, despite all logical assumptions to the contrary, Catholic France fought against the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. Here was a conflict where political scores were to be settled, no matter faith or creed. This concluded with the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, whose provisions included greater autonomy within the empire for states like Bavaria and Saxony, as well as acceptance of Dutch independence by Spain. By weakening the Habsburgs relative to France, the conflict altered European balance of power and set the stage for the wars of Louis XIV. And it's funny I should mention France, because in France, questions over who controlled religious matters and authority were at the centre of the French wars of religion. French kings believed they were God's representative on earth, making them divine. This role meant that they had to safeguard their people against heresy. They also controlled all French church appointments, shifting the loyalty of priests to the king over the church and religion. Therefore, there was no separation between church and state. Many priests and bishops appointed by the king were not educated in religious matters, and as a result their appointments were more political than spiritual. This lack of priestly quality led to resentment from the French people, which combined with the new Protestant ideas of Martin Luther and John Calvin to form an opposition movement led by the nobility. The affair of the placards, 1534, saw French Calvinists organising and issuing a storm of anti-Catholic pamphlets all over Paris, including the king's bedchamber. This act infuriated King Francis I, and he declared Calvinism a heresy. Moreover, the affair caused the king to see Protestantism as a threat to the body politic and his authority. The Edict of Chateaubriand, 1551, made Protestant gatherings illegal, offered incentives to informers of Protestant locations, and punished those who sheltered Protestants, known in France as Huguenots. In 1562, Catherine de' Medici, the regent of her underage son, King Charles XI, tried to compromise with the Huguenots by issuing the Edict of Saint-Germain, which offered limited toleration and recognition of their faith. Instead of peace, civil war erupted. The first phase of the French Wars of Religion lasted from 1562 to 1570. A marriage alliance between Queen Catherine's daughter and the Huguenot leader King Henry of Navarre in 1572 ended in tragedy as Huguenots attending the wedding were slaughtered in Paris by Catholics. This event is known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre and brought on the second phase of the French religious wars from 1572 to 1598. The Edict of Nantes, created by King Henry IV, formerly Henry of Navarre, recognised the Protestant faith and protected it under French law. Protestants gained restricted freedoms to worship and build their own churches. For nearly a century, Protestants enjoyed a measure of religious freedom. French kings maintained their absolute authority over the combined Catholic Church and state. While these measures did not eliminate social, political and religious tensions in France, they did stabilise the state. However, the edict was revoked by King Louis XIV in 1685. By the end of the European Wars of Religion, France was almost completely Catholic. There were still pockets of Calvinists in the region, but they were driven out in 1685 by Louis XIV. The empire remained religiously diverse after the 30 Years' War, with the northern part primarily Protestant and the southern and eastern parts Catholic. These are but a snapshot of the conflicts which were ongoing during the European Wars of Religion. I haven't even mentioned the 9 Years' War, the 80 Years' War. Man, did they love to time their wars. The Danker Wars, the Hessian War, the Dusseldorf Cow War, and that is only to name a few. And yes, the last one is real. It in fact took place in 1651, and that's all I'm going to say on the matter. War after war, all potentially blamed on one man with a thesis, a hammer, and a nail. However, we cannot just focus on the Protestant side of everything. The Catholic Church, which, before 1517-ish, had enjoyed total dominance of the Christian religious landscape in the majority of Europe, and it was not cowering in a corner while the wave of reformers spread anti-papal practices and theology across the continent. They were, as always, ready for a theological fight, and they did not disappoint. The Counter-Reformation, also called the Catholic Reformation or Catholic Revival, was a period of Catholic resurgence that was initiated in response to the Protestant Reformation at the time. It began with the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, and largely ended with the conclusion of the European Wars of Religion. Initiated to address the effects of the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation was a comprehensive effort composed of apologetic and polemical documents and ecclesiastical confirmation as decreed by the Council of Trent. The last of these included the efforts of the imperial diets of the Holy Roman Empire, heresy trials and the Inquisition, anti-corruption efforts, spiritual movements, and the founding of new religious orders. Such policies had long-lasting effects in European history, with exiles of Protestants continuing until the 1781 Patent of Toleration, although small expulsions took place in the 19th century. Pope Paul III, reigning from 1534 to 1549, was the first pope to respond, convening the important Council of Trent, which reacted to Protestant teachings on faith, grace and the sacraments, and attempted to reform training for the priesthood. Many church laws established there are still part of the Catholic Church today. Some such reforms include: bishops established schools in their regions to educate priests. Bishops would now frequently visit churches under their authority to ensure there was no corruption. Priests who broke their vows of celibacy and slept with women were rooted out. That sounds uncomfortable. Priests and bishops who indulged too much in luxury were also removed. The Roman Inquisition was established in 1542 to control heresy within Catholic territories, and the Jesuits under St. Ignatius of Loyola undertook educational and missionary work aimed at conversion or reconversion. Reforms included the foundation of seminaries for proper teaching of priests in the spiritual life and the theological traditions of the Church, the reform of religious life by returning orders to their spiritual foundations, and new spiritual movements focusing on the devotional life and the personal relationships with Christ, including the Spanish mystics and the French school of spirituality. One reform element of the Catholic Church was to sanction new orders of monks and nuns to carry out church reforms. The orders were primarily focused on emulating the life of Christ and performing good works. Some such orders include the Theatines, established in 1524, were monks who focused on providing charity for the sick and founding hospitals. The Capuchins, not to be confused with the monkeys, were established in 1529 and were Franciscan monks who took vows of poverty and preached to the general public, wandering from town to town to spread the word of God. Ursulines, established 1535, were nuns who emphasized spiritual education for girls. The Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, established 1540, were monks considered soldiers or warriors of Christ. They hunted heretics, whether they be Protestant, Jews or otherwise, and served as missionaries. They founded many schools and universities to teach the true message of Christ. Many Jesuits' colleges still exist today. After the European Wars of Religion, Jesuits focused on evangelizing indigenous peoples in territories controlled by European countries, and on academic education in the humanistic tradition, even funding universities worldwide. The Counter-Reformation also involved political activities that included the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa and Bombay Basin. Spain and the Holy Roman Empire used the Inquisition the most, which is credited with keeping Protestantism suppressed throughout the Reformation. The Carolina Code of 1532, implemented by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was a criminal law that determined how heresy trials would operate in the region. Torture was considered a legal way to get an accused heretic to confess. Any law protecting the defendant was suspended if the crime was exceptional, as heresy was. A primary emphasis of the Counter-Reformation was a mission to reach parts of the world that had been colonised as predominantly Catholic, and also try to reconvert nations such as Sweden and England that once were Catholic from the time of the Christianization of Europe, but had been lost to the Reformation. Various Counter-Reformation theologians focused only on defending doctrinal positions such as the sacraments and pious practices that were attacked by the Protestant reformers, up to the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965. The efforts of the Catholic Church to first slow the erosion of its authority and then push back against Protestantism across the world shows that it was no lame duck. It had enjoyed some 1,000 years of authority and control over the hearts, minds and souls of most of Europe, and it was determined to come out of this relatively in one piece. Catholicism fought for survival as hard as Protestantism fought for its right to exist. Well, there we have it. After 2 episodes of carefully editing and re-editing notes, I think I've covered the fundamentals of the Protestant Reformation. Oh, did I mention Johannes Bergenhagen, or the Lutheran martyrs of Antwerp? I didn't. Well, look them up yourselves. And you are right, I have avoided the Reformation that took place across different areas of the United Kingdom, but surely that deserves its own episode, if I ever recover from this foray into the Reformation. The iceberg that is the Reformation is so vast that I haven't even skimmed the surface. There is a reason this subject is used as whole modules at universities, and not just a footnote. There are nations, cities, towns, families, individuals who are totally reshaped by the events I have discussed with you. It is incomprehensible to even the most learned of us to understand everything which happened during the Protestant Reformation, and, to be honest, I would leave them be. I will, however, finish with this. The 30 Years' War is thought to have claimed between 4 and 12 million lives. Of that, around 450,000 people died in combat. Disease and famine took the lion's share of the death toll. Estimates suggest that 20% of Europe's people perished, with some areas seeing their population fall by as much as 60%. When all sides are fundamentally reading from the same books, praying to be saved by the Messiah, worshipping the same God, what would their God say to those kinds of figures and those 4 to 12 million souls appearing at his gates? Maybe, "Don't blame me." So, for now, thank you for listening. Remember, if you've enjoyed this, be sure to give the podcast 5 stars, give us a follow, and maybe see if you can share it with somebody else who has your same masochistic tendencies. We're on Instagram at Cogito_Ergo_Pod, so please come and give us a follow and send me a message if there's anything in particular you would like me to cover in future episodes. Also look us up on Facebook. Just type in Cogito Ergo Pod, should come up at the top. And if you would like, we also have a YouTube channel where these episodes are uploaded. So for now, I would like to thank you for listening and for persevering, and hopefully I will speak to you again soon.